Hey, everyone. Welcome to Unique Ways with Thomas Gerard, an audio podcast. We've got a real legend on today, not just in the design world, but in a bigger sense. And I'll describe him briefly. He's an American architect and graphic designer who's written, designed, and published 90 books and created the TED conferences, the EG conference, TEDMED, and WWW conference. Please join me in welcoming, celebrating Richard Saul Wurman. Welcome.
It's nice to be here, and you catch me just before I get really old, because Sunday is my birthday.
That's funny. So I want to start off with a question that's a relatable one, and that is about the future. So with climate, more than human worlds, AI, what are we looking at when we're looking at the future?
It's a it's a good question, but it's an overwhelming question because there's so many slices. And if you just ask me, what about today, which is one teeny part of tomorrow, anticipatory to tomorrow, I would need some bounds to pick out the slice in which to respond, because I suspect some places and some nows, if tomorrow is next, some nows are without flaws, and others are terribly flawed, going from the agonies of starvation, wars, and crap in the oceans to people who are having probably a very pleasant, interesting, thoughtful day and thinking up some new ideas. So the extremes exist in the most dismal times. Now, the extremes can be disastrous, but some extremes, like even cutting yourself, can be interesting. I don't mean self-cutting yourself. Just an accident of cutting yourself could be painful. You don't want it to happen. You don't want it to happen again. But in that moment, in what you see your body does, what a doctor might do, or putting in one kind of stitch, or just taping it, or how it heals, there's a whole world of interest for me. I know that's a radical thing to say because it sounds violent, but I don't mean the violence of the cut. I mean that interest dominates tomorrow for me, and I'm not looking for a happy tomorrow. My anticipation is, because as I mentioned, I am present for my 88th birthday is Sunday, so I am thinking about more today than yesterday, even my mortality. That short lens makes my answers just different. I don't think we'll have a disastrous climate change of a catastrophic nature, except the ordinary catastrophes that occur with weather catastrophes and the flooding and hurricanes and earthquakes, etc., before I die, assuming I'll live maybe 2 to 4 years from now. However, I would think, unless there's some radical breakthrough, the Earth is due for a shit show. There is nothing being done that will change the course that we're on to make our place change radically, particularly if the oceans change by the two major currents inverting because of as you know, the Gulf Stream goes out and then turns under itself, and it's like an escalator turning around on itself. And that, which they don't talk about that much, that radical change affects the whole Earth, and it can just happen from a cascade of Greenland melting. Now, I'm picking at one point, and the people who are talking about climate change and the filth in the earth and waste are talking about another. Now, you can take a different whole subject, and today there was a robust dance of friendship going on between two large nations in the world, that clearly you can see a path that they both could take that seems logical, that would put a shift in all of the whole world and the alliances and wars and conquests and the endless desire to have more land, the land greed that nations have had since Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great. It always has had that. That's another slice of looking dim about things. And then I pick up a marvelous article on Facebook today by Wolfram about his explanation of AI and the clarity that the first few pages showed in him trying to explain something that for people like myself are quite difficulty in understanding. I'm not a very smart person. I'm a curious person. And but my lack of intellect hinders my lack of understanding in some subjects like that. That wasn't a terribly good answer, but it's such a big question. There's a question you ask when you meet somebody, or I'm asked when you meet somebody in the lobby of a conference and they say, how is everything going? And it's a question that you can't answer. And it's a sort of, I don't mean your question was insulting, but it's a question of such breadth that it can't be answered. I could sit next to you and have a conversation about one teeny aspect of one pattern for maybe the next 3 years, but with no time limit on how are things going, basically. 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 5 years. The future is the expectation for the near future is terribly difficult. 3 years is about the limit of having some coherence in certain subjects. 5 years, it gets quite vague. And past that, if you go back and look at what people write about as futures in 1950 and 1960 and 1970, 1980, they're extraordinarily off the mark, except those who predicted that about Big Brother and sort of predictions you can't go wrong about throughout history. Sorry for going on there, but.
No, that's fantastic. The next one's a bit more specific and is kind of in service of our audience, who I imagine is seeing this scrolling through social media, or even on a more immediate level. And the topic is the big tech layoffs. Do you think that these are kind of a signpost or something to be alerted by?
The fear is that news begets news. And one bank failure makes the next one fail. And the rapid expansion of the availability of correct information and pseudo information, faux information, I guess they call it, to so many people so quickly that the information itself makes news. And it's like the organization of how you organize the same information. If you organize it in different ways, it changes the information. And the information stays the same, but the organization of it changes. The availability of it changes what will happen. So when the newspapers write a great deal, or the newspapers, I mean television, social media, I'm just using newspapers as a metaphor for news. How they write about it and how frequently it's written about and how people get that news changes the news. So if you have many stories about layoffs, it somehow gives permission, it loses its strength as a story If somebody one day lays off 1,000 people, another one, and that seems huge, and the next day 5,000, and that seems huge, but it gives permission that the next story of 6,000 or 10,000 doesn't seem so big, and then it becomes what happens, and it feeds on itself, giving people permission to cut back and permission to change how they run their company and what patterns they see in running a business. So the information itself, how it's presented, gives people permission to make have ideas. There's a lot of I had a Bentley Continental a few years ago, a used one, and it was a wonderful car. Seats just two and two squashed in the back. And I opened the booklet up and it said the car goes 200, and it was an old one, but it said the car goes 206 miles an hour. So there was a piece of information that they were bragging about, and they would write up that it's the fastest production car in the world, and yet it's meaningless. But when people are laid off, the 10,000 people who are laid off in some company or predicted in some company, we don't know who those people are, and any plans for their replacement or a change in their business. We don't know enough about those 10,000 people to make it an interesting enough story to ask the follow-up question, which isn't written, and whether they're slimming down or moving their offices or letting off 10,000 and hiring 10,000 the next week in a different location because they're opening a different office. Anytime people are laid off, it is a very disturbing thing to me, because I certainly identify with being out of work, being fired. I've been fired a number of times in my life. I only had 2 jobs that I wasn't fired from. And I think the news begets the news. I think the banks, the worthlessness of the money, the bankruptcy of companies, the decision about what money is, bitcoins and all those monies things, which I never quite understand, is no bigger illusion than our dollar, which is not backed by anything anyway. But we have an agreement that it's worth something, and there never was that agreement about the other kinds of money. This agreement allows things to go on, and we're losing the agreement to tell the truth, and we're losing the sensitivity to other people. So I think these large layoffs and the largeness of certain corporations is a desensitizing. It just desensitizes us to the news. That was not a good answer to your question.
No, that was great. Yeah.
No, it wasn't great. Don't say it was great, because I didn't like it.
Okay, well, so the next one is
I would like a smaller question that isn't so
yeah,
beyond anybody's ability to understand and just croak on.
here's one you might like, which is specifically for you, I think. So some of my students complain about having the big guests on the show because they can't relate to them. However, we had John Maeda on the show, and he confessed that it wasn't until his 40s that he started eating protein for breakfast. He says he was a carbs guy on his day-to-day, and then started eating protein. And after I heard that, I went out and bought some protein foods. Do you have any kind of day-to-day advice that ordinary people can maybe use in their lives?
Well, yes, I will say that, but I will tell you that I am not proselytizing, but I am saying that that there's certain words, keywords, to who all your audience. If I asked your audience, let's say your audience has 100 people, and what's the first thing that the couple things that they were trying to do, or what their parents wanted, or teachers wanted, or what were they trying, and what are the key words in their life? And they would say comfort, they would say success. Perfectly understandable. And they want to do something and do it very well and do it better and better and better. The opposite of that is the way I've tried to lead my life. So if the opposite has any sense, then it might question those being acceptable words. I think comfort is your enemy. It's the edge, the existence of terror, the existence of not knowing, the edge of not knowing, the potential failure of everything you're working on that allows me to think up new ideas. Success is not interesting to me, which success is made up of 3 words: money, power, and fame in the general public, and doing something better and better. And I would rather do projects that I start because I don't know anything about the project. And the project for me is learning about the answer to my discomfort in the question about some subject. So the books that I've done and conferences that I've run have been based on my understanding of what it's like not to understand, and not knowing what the person is going to talk about, or not knowing about the subject that I'm going to write about. And it was the journey that I write about, and it was the failures in my lack of understanding, the discomforts and things that allowed me to have an interesting life. So if you say, are you happy, or you want to, or I would say, no, I'm not particularly happy, but today has been very interesting. And I hope tomorrow is interesting too. So the answer to your question or is that if I look at a table and I sit down at a restaurant, I look at the space between things rather than the dishes themselves. I look at the silence rather than the noise. And the things that interest me are things that I don't understand and that are left out. Now, I'm not proselytizing that people should have that edgier life, or they might find it too terrifying. I don't like to be terrified, but I accept it as my way of moving on. When you learn to walk as a small child, your parents or whoever is taking care of you, you hang on to their fingers. You've seen this with a child. They lift you up and they hang on to your fingers. One finger, they wrap their whole hand around it. And you give them the comfort to throw out a leg and go through the terror of losing their equilibrium. That's a failure. You're failing your equilibrium. Your natural thing is that you want to be plopped on the floor. You don't want to stand up to begin with. But what occurs is you go through this a number of times, you lose your equilibrium, then you gain it by throwing the other leg out. And the net sum is that you're moving forward. That's a metaphor. That by the failure of losing your equilibrium, putting another foot out, and then the other foot out, and the other foot out, you go through that terror and then confidence, and terror and confidence. So it shows you that the discomfort is also your friend because it helps you move forward. And so metaphorically, I tend to look at the opposites of things as a means of having interesting days.
Great. The next question,
That was a better answer than my other question. So whoever's listening, discount the shit I said before.
Okay. The next one I don't really want to ask, but I will ask it. The relationship between work and life. I think a lot of our audience probably assumes that you're operating at 110% all the time. Is this the case?
Well, there's 2 words that are implied or explicit in your question, which is the idea of work. And of course, the opposite of that is play in people's minds are work and vacation. And I don't feel like I've had a day at work in 40, 50 years. I don't, nobody asks me to do anything. I've written, you said 90, it's probably closer to 100. But I've never been asked to do a book. I have never been asked, I've never had a client for a book. I've never had a publisher ask me to do a book. I've never had a client ask me to do a project. If I got anything done, it's because I wanted to do it very badly. So I don't work, and today, tomorrow, and really in the last 20 years, I've lost track of what day it is, whether it's Saturday, Sunday, or Monday or Tuesday. I knew it better before computers, but I tend not to look at the calendar. I missed this meeting, but it wasn't even on my calendar. I don't work. I don't feel I work at 100% of the time, but I'm thinking about things 300% of the time. I'm decided to write some fables. I'm in the process of writing a whole series of fables right now. And that's what I was doing when you called me. And I was writing a fable today about, I was thinking of a time, this is all made up, of course, when all the smartest people in the whole world, the 25 or 30 of them, got together and they were inventing what came out as being words. They were inventing the word, and they were inventing how they could use the word put together with other words to explain things. And then eventually they realized they could record those by either a little triangular piece of wood, and they called it cuneiform, or some oil mixed with some charcoal and wrote it down, or had some strikes for numbers, or they could record these. And the story goes on. I won't tell you the whole story, but they developed papers and books and things of that sort. Then they had to have a place to put these, and they had to organize them. And they realized that all the words they wrote came in just two varieties. And people came in two varieties. And most of everything was made up. That nothing was for sure. Nothing was the truth. Everything was fantasy. And so all the work that they produced was called fiction. And much later, they had a small shelf, which was called nonfiction. Now that, I explain it much in a longer way in the fable, but it was the idea, if we look at our society, that if you go to a bookstore or the bestsellers, you have a nonfiction and a fiction. And isn't it strange that it isn't the reverse, that you start off with the truth, which is what nonfiction is, but the basis of it is saying it's not fiction. This is really the truth, instead of being the truth and fiction, or actuality and fiction. But even the way we think is not dominated by clarity, how we divide our work together. So when you go in a bookstore or you look at the New York Times bestseller list, I think you'll find it, I find it very odd that the word fiction dominates literature. Did I make my point? Did you understand what I'm saying?
I think so, yeah. Nice elaboration, actually. Okay, so this next one, you and I chatted briefly about this, but we had Timothy Goodman on the show, who's kind of a trending designer all over New York City, designed these NBA basketball shoes. And you and I spoke about trends briefly. I was wondering what you think about this idea of a trending topic.
Oh my goodness. When you say somebody designing basketball shoes, I find that, or the trending thing is like influencers.
Mhm.
Gosh, I think you chose the wrong person to talk to. I just am, I am off the grid, sir. I just think up ways of explaining things that I'm interested in, and some people have found that interesting themselves. But I don't, by not having a publisher or a publicist or a job, trends have little interest to me. I travel well, and so I get pajamas in first class when I go across the ocean. And so I have lots of pajamas, and I only wear pajamas. And I don't go to dinner parties or openings or events. I go out with my wife once a week for dinner. We don't go to people's houses for dinner. We don't have people over here for dinner. I think about things, and I love television. So I'm not into trends. Now that people do things, trending to me is somebody doing something where it is like fashion. It's purposely doing something that's different to get attention. And by doing it, it can be beautiful. But in fact, some fashion is absolutely gorgeous. To me, it's not something that I focus upon, but I like the fact that it gives people permission, that every trend or anything you do gives people permission behind you or beside you. I was going to do another conference, and it was going to be called Shoulders. And it was going to be about the people's shoulders we stand on and the people's shoulders we rub. And I know that my friends all fit into that category. They all have somebody's shoulders they stood on, and they all have people's shoulders that they rub, younger, older, male, female. I'm not saying copy, I'm saying rub, and I'm not saying replace, but that to me is human. The acknowledgement of rubbing shoulders, and by rubbing shoulders, you're given permission to do things you might not have thought of without that existence, that physical existence. So somebody who does tennis shoes, if that's what they decided to do, and I think that's fascinating. I just watched a show on television, which I didn't think I would like at all, a documentary series, I think 6 parts, on pizza. 6 different people making pizza in the world. And in each show, it was somebody who, in a Zen-like way, became the pizza. And I was fascinated with the depth to which, I thought I would be bored out of my head, the depth at which they focused on doing something extraordinarily well that I would never have thought of, but made me go out the next day for lunch and order pizza because it was still in my mouth, in my head, and my mouth. Fashion, the part of fashion in design is not interesting to me. I think I rubbed Lou Kahn's shoulders, and I stood on his shoulders, and a number of other people. But it was not copying a style, and it wasn't fashion, and it wasn't a following. Now, there's always been those things. I think there probably always will be those things. It's just not the sandbox I play in. I think by doing TED, I gave other people permission to do TED-like conferences, not copy me, but permission as a person just to do something that appealed to you as an individual, and make the changes, make it better, make it worse. The person who bought it changed it radically but he's done some amazingly wonderful things with it, and I applaud him. And other people, once that the gate was down, that a single individual without a company behind them, without a sponsor, without money, could just say, I'm going to do a conference and do it. I think that took away the boundaries. So that has an influence, and that has a trend, that when people see something being done, and it was interesting to see people talk about different things, except instead of a medical conference, which was only about eye, ears, nose, and throat people, and they all did the same thing and all talked to each other, to have some group of people where you didn't know what the person did sitting next to you. And that trend of the confluence of nouns kissing nouns, that different disciplines kissed each other, that permission that was, I think, given by some of the conferences to others, people have gone and run with that. Now, is that an influencer? Is that a trend? Or is that just opening up and giving somebody permission to do what something that appealed to them in a basic level, of having a big pile of rocks in a circle to sit around and sit next to somebody in front of a fire and share that everybody did something that the other people didn't do, and you could learn from everybody. So is it a trend? Does Facebook make us more human or less human? I find part of it humanizing and part of it not. I know the trend is that's old-fashioned, and old people, I guess, use Facebook, and it's not a young person's thing. But I would just go ahead to your next question.
Okay. The next one is in service of podcasters, people who want to be podcasters. You and I chatted briefly about Debbie Millman, who we had on the show, and we took a critical angle, talking about what it means to have a set list of questions, and kind of the problems with that. Did you want to? Can you maybe share something about that?
Well, Debbie Millman is one of the star people in the design world for cherry picking the people on the A list and interviewing them. And I think she's interviewed some amazing people. When I went in to be interviewed with her, I didn't know who she was, because you see that I walked down a slightly different path. And so she asked me to come in and be interviewed. And I was in New York at that time. I'm in Florida now, and I was in Newport then. And I came in to be interviewed, and I didn't know who she was and didn't know the situation. I was just being agreeable to talk to somebody and have a conversation, much like today, slightly incoherent. And the conversation, she felt, didn't go well because I didn't want to answer some of the questions, because they were family questions and they were a set list that she was reading off of. So I think she thought the interview was terrible. Actually, I didn't think my interview was much better then than today. Today's interview is terrible. I'm doing a bad job today. I know that. And I'll have an extra drink of sake tonight after this. But whatever first question you ask, see, you have a set list of questions. I would ask, I don't even know if I'd ask somebody a question first. I would just start talking to them and see where it led, but not have an idea of where it's going, and not try to have people answer the same set of questions so you can compare them. And I think that's what some interviewers do, have these weighty questions about some subject, and they have comfort in having those set of questions answered by various people in their own ways, and you then can compare their answers. And it's much easier then to write an article or do a comparison of people's different people's answering the same question. And I don't say that's a wrong thing to do, but it's not in the nature of free conversation. Your questions to me were, I was finished one, then you went to another thing instead of going on from the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I would have I remember now the conversation we had together, but I remember that earlier conversation where it started and we went on and trusted the flow of where it was going. You're asking me a question and then going on to another whole change. It's not going on from the last question. It's not a conversation. And I'm having difficulty in relating to it. This seems more like an interview, more like an audition or a test than a conversation.
Hopefully this last note improves on that. Which
do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I'm going to try to fix it.
I'm trying to be a bad boy. I'm just telling you what I think.
So the last piece around closing remarks, I've added this word B-roll, which I think takes on new meaning these days. But you know, I offer this kind of last part for us to expand a bit and talk more if we want to. You know, often I use this for a call to action, but I imagine you don't necessarily want to do that. Are there things that need to be said that that we can talk about here as the closing remarks?
Well, I will tell you, I have a request to make of you.
Absolutely.
My request is get it on my calendar and let's do this again.
Absolutely.
Do this again and just burn this whole half an hour or whatever it is and just let us talk. And I would be happy to answer that question in full. And you answer back and we have a conversation. Now, I'm not telling you how to run your business or your podcast or whatever it is. I'm just suggesting that I would feel more comfortable having a conversation of equals than answering a question like I am giving a speech in front of an audience. I like the flow of conversation. I adore the conversation. The last conference that I did had the subtitle of Intellectual Jazz, because it was just conversation, unplanned, unagenda between two people who didn't know who they were going to talk to. Sometimes they did something similar. Sometimes they did something different. Sometimes they had met each other or knew of each other, and sometimes they were strangers. And they were some of the people I get to talk with me. They were absolutely the top-notch people in medicine, science, Nobel Prize winners, music, the arts, education, the brain, different things, cartography, biology. And I enjoyed that very much. This, I felt uncomfortable with being asked a question and then after it was over, not getting a response of saying, well, that was a stupid answer, or I lost you on that, like people do, like I do. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I'm just so appreciative and don't want to overstep.
Appreciative of what?
Of you being here and sharing your ideas.
Oh, don't be appreciative. I feel like I'm just a schlepper that just is interested in things, and have had the privilege of being able to be tolerated enough to get some things done that allowed me to have an interesting days. And my interesting days are made up of conversation. I've had several wonderful conversations. People called me. I have so many contacts from the life I've had, and my phone rings constantly, but we then have a conversation and I don't know where it's going. And they don't call me with an agenda. And I don't have anything to ask them. During COVID, when I didn't leave the house at all, I called some people and said, do they know some interesting people that I don't know? And then I thought of some people I always wanted to talk to and never met. So I placed a whole series of calls to about 10 people who answered my call. And I said, what I would like to do is talk to you, have a Zoom call with you. We'll have one for an hour. And if you like it or enjoy it, a week and a half later, call me back. And they're still going on for years now.
Wow.
And I still have not met the people, except on Zoom. And one's a geriatric psychiatrist. Now, there's a publisher someplace I always admired. Another is a musician someplace, just people. And we just chat about things. And I've learned, one's a small particle physicist professor in Texas. And I enjoy just the conversation. And I don't know where it's going. And I call them back and they call me back. And those are really unexpectedly interesting for me. I don't record anything. I just have conversations. And I don't have a following. And I'm not a very public person. But I say yes to everybody, like yourself, on the chance that it'll be a conversation that I'll walk away from with some new thought, some new thread that I hadn't thought of before, or I say something that I hadn't thought of before. And I believe that only comes when you have a conversation, not have set questions to answer. So I'm sorry I wasn't better for you or do it the way you want. I'm not trying to change the way you live your life. I'm not proselytizing. It's just the best of my opinion I'm giving you.
I love it. I trust it fully. It's such a pleasure to have you here. So just to wrap up, so much gratitude. I think our audience is the same. And
I think I disappointed your audience, and I apologize. And if you do it again with me, I would do it under those other kind of, not rules, but a suggestion. We just kind of talk to each other.
Fantastic.
I ask you some questions and you ask me some, just how it comes. What I think of when you say something and what you think of when I say something.
Fantastic. I love it. Thank you for that invitation. And thank you for sharing your time today. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.